So first of all, hello and welcome to FO Talks with me, Claire Price. Today we're talking to the authors of a new book called War in Ukraine, Making Sense of a Senseless Conflict. Medea Benjamin is the co-founder of both CODEPINK and the international human rights organization Global Exchange. And Nicolas J.S is an independent journalist and a researcher at CODEPINK. Together, they've written a book which they say puts the Ukrainian conflict in context. It challenges the dominant Western narrative and examines the opportunities for peace. So, welcome to you both.
Thank you. Nice to be on with you, Claire.
You're very welcome. Fair Observer is a platform for citizen journalism, and we would love you to join the conversation. So please do put your questions or comments in the chat box. And if that isn't enough room for your thoughts, then do, of course, pen us an article, which we can publish at fairobserver.com. So we'll go straight into the questions, and then we'll go to our comments from other people. But first of all, Medea, could you just summarize the main points of your book?
We make it very clear in the book that we totally condemn Russia's invasion from all sides, whether it's legally or morally. And then we talk about that this war didn't just fall from the sky, that this is in a context and we have to understand the context. We wrote it from the point of view of people living in the United States who wanted to understand the role that the U.S. has played, and the U.S. in the context also of NATO. So we give quite a lot of background about U.S. involvement in the events leading up to the 2014, what we call a coup. We talk about the expansion of NATO and how that played such an important role. And then we look at all of the issues since the war has begun, such as the sanctions, the way the media has portrayed this, the fear of a nuclear war, and get into talking about possible solutions.
Let me just bring in Nicolas. What prompted you to write this book? Do you feel that you're filling a gap in the market, as it were?
Yeah, I mean, basically the publisher got in touch with us and asked us to write the book. So we had already been writing quite a lot of articles about Ukraine. It seemed to be a very critical and central event historically that we find ourselves confronted with. I had written about Ukraine back in 2014.
But do you feel that you're saying things that the media isn't saying, for example?
Well, yes. I mean, what we're trying to do is to give people actual information that they can use to make up their own minds about, what should be done about this crisis. And so, yes, there's a lot of background and even a lot of insight into what is happening now that we're not hearing from the Western corporate media. It was this, we quote a former US ambassador to Saudi Arabia in the book, a guy called Chaz Freeman, who says he has never seen a war or a crisis where the entire media debate is so reduced to propaganda from both sides.
Okay, Medea, wasn't Russia's invasion of Ukraine a clear sign of colonial aggression, or are there some justifications that do stand up?
Well, we don't call it justification because we think it's important to separate, was this war provoked, which we say yes, was it justified, which we say no. And so when you look at, from the point of view of Russia's legitimate security interests, there are definitely legitimate security interests that have been violated by the West for quite a long time now. When I talk to US audiences, I try to put it in the context of what if you had a hostile power like China or Russia who is making military agreements with Mexico or with Canada. You know, the US has had now 200 years of what we call the Monroe Doctrine, saying nobody can have any outside influence in our backyard in Latin America. And here you have Russia that is surrounded by US bases bases, where US nuclear weapons are in 5 European countries, where the expansion of NATO has come right up into the border of Russia. And so certainly there are legitimate interests. We see recently the war games that have been going on that include a simulation of a nuclear war with Russia. So that is the context that we think is important to recognize, that Russia does have legitimate security interests.
Do you feel that you've gone out a bit on a limb with this in terms of trying to understand Putin's reasons for going to war? What's the sort of response been to your book so far?
Nicolas, you want to answer that?
Yeah, sure, Medea, and then we'll go to Nicolas.
No, I was saying, why doesn't Nicolas answer?
Whatever you like. Okay. Yeah, I think I think when people read the book, they will understand that this is a history that has developed since the 1990s, since the end of the Cold War. And I think if you compare Russia's actions over that whole time to US actions over that whole time, I think that provides the context for what we say in the introduction, that in a sense, there are two conflicts taking place here. One is a conflict inside Ukraine between the Ukrainian and Russian armed forces, but there is a larger conflict also taking place that many have referred to as a new Cold War. We don't particularly like that term because in a sense, it's actually a revival and a continuation of the old Cold War. And so for these 30 years since the end of the Cold War, the US has established military bases all over the world. There are now 860 something of them. The US has, just as we condemn Russia for the crime of aggression in invading Ukraine, we also condemn the United States for, in fact, committing serial aggression against a whole series of countries, from Serbia.
Let's just bring in Medea, because we just want to go back to what you were talking about before in terms of NATO enlargement. You say in your book that without NATO's expansion towards Russia's borders and history of aggression, we doubt that Russia would have invaded Ukraine. Can you just explain that for us?
Yes, we look back at the academics, the diplomats, the foreign policy experts at that time in 1991 around the reunification of Germany, and and take a lot of their quotes that we put in the book saying that this was an agreement that was made with Russia, that that NATO would not expand. And then as the years go by and the NATO alliance violated that agreement, we quote others who were saying, this is a red line for Russia. This is going to lead to war. This is a very bad idea. In fact, the head of the CIA today, William Burns, who is now one of the few members of the Biden administration who is talking to his counterpart in Russia because they don't want this to expand to a wider war, is one of the most prescient from earlier times in talking about how this was going to lead to a war. So this was a war foretold, and we definitely feel that, in our opinions, NATO should have dissolved at the time when the Warsaw Pact dissolved, that there was no need for this military alliance that included the United States, that Europe was totally capable of having its own security agreements, and that NATO has been an aggressive force. And were it not for the NATO expansion, we don't think this war would have happened.
There has been obviously criticism of that thesis in the sense that countries are actually applying to join NATO. It's not as if NATO is expanding organically. And actually countries that are frightened of Russia, countries on their border that, would rather have someone looking out for them. Doesn't the theory of NATO expansion deny those countries agency?
What you have here is really a classic security dilemma. The actions that each side takes that it sees as defensive are naturally interpreted by the other as aggressive, and so that really, looking at it from that objective point of view, why has the US and NATO refused to discuss these concerns with Russia for 30 years now? Yeah. And so in that sense, I would say that the US and NATO have been diplomatically aggressive in essentially from the triumphalism of the end of the Cold War. They have crafted a foreign policy and a policy toward Russia based on Russia's diminution as a world power and as a military power, that essentially says, well, yes, during the Cold War, we needed all these arms control agreements. We needed to have a hotline between Moscow and Washington, but we don't have to afford Russia that respect anymore. We can treat it as a sort of has-been, and we are going to carry on with our policy, and if they don't like it, well, after some time they will get used to it. And that essentially has been the policy. And since 2007, at the Munich International Security Forum, when Vladimir Putin first really raised these issues in public, he has continued to raise them, and he has continued to be rebuffed. And so this is, as Medea said, all the warnings from experienced Western and American diplomats have said that this is unnecessary. It is asking for trouble, and we are heading for a crisis with Russia. And here we are.
Medea, has the war in a way backfired now that Sweden and Finland are joining NATO?
Absolutely. I think that the Russians obviously did not want to strengthen NATO, and this invasion has done that. Well, there are divisions that are cropping up now in Europe about how to deal with this war. In the beginning, it brought the Europeans all together with the US. Yes, it brought Sweden and Finland into wanting to join NATO. And I would say from our point of view, from a negative standpoint, it also has increased militarization from the West. Many countries in NATO had not reached the NATO, quote, goal of having 2% of their gross domestic product spent on the military. And our friends who were fighting that were saying, we want to keep our national healthcare system. We want to keep our free college education. We don't want to be like you in the United States and spend all this money on the military. And yet, once Russia invaded, we saw Germany and other countries now pouring so much more money into the military. So I think it's had a terrible effect, of course, first and foremost on the Ukrainian people, but also on the region and the world as a whole of increasing militarism.
Okay, so staying with you, Medea, that's one sort of reason, if you like, for the war. Are there any other key reasons that you highlight in your book?
Who are you addressing now? Sorry.
Medea.
Oh, well, we talk about the U.S. involvement in the uprising that we call a peaceful civilian uprising against a corrupt government in 2014. But it's so interesting how the US feels that Russia interfered in our presidential election, and yet here you have an example of the US interfering absolutely directly in internal affairs of Ukraine, to the point where we describe the whole series of events with the US getting involved in actually handpicking who would be the next leader of Ukraine.
And I think you're talking about the Victoria Nuland leaked recording.
Absolutely. And, you know, we say that there will be more coming out in the future that will tell us exactly how involved the US was and the role that Biden himself, who was not president at the time, but the role that he played. It will be interesting to see when we do get more information out about what role he played. But this was quite remarkable level of US interference in the internal affairs of another country. And then we talk about all of the weapons and training and involvement militarily that the Western countries have had in Ukraine, starting particularly in 2015, training 10,000 Ukrainian military every single year, pouring weapons into that country. And so we think it's important to show that the US hasn't been involved in a civil war going on in Ukraine, involved in helping to create that civil war. And this is another area where we explain a lot in our book that the outside influence in stirring up and building up the tensions.
So 8 years really of those tensions being stirred up, essentially. Nevertheless, whatever happened 8 years ago, Putin still decided to invade Ukraine. Can anyone really be blamed but him, Nicolas?
Well, yes, if one person is directly responsible, it is obviously Putin. But he is the head of a government, and he has kept getting reelected. His opinion polls have always shown him to be very popular in Russia, because he, after the complete implosion of Russia under sort of Western economic shock doctrine in the 1990s, Putin rebuilt the Russian economy. He reined in some of the excesses of some of the, kleptocrats who had appropriated huge amounts of the economy, and so I think this personalization of the conflict does not really help us, frankly. It is the thing that when I meet sort of hostile questioning about about our book, it is the thing that people always fall back on, because and this is of course a pattern in US and Western policy for many years, to personalize their enemies instead of looking at the interests at stake, political situation. Okay. Saddam Hussein, who was a US ally, became, a new Hitler, and so on and so forth.
Medea, that's a really interesting point that Nicolas raised, the personalization of sort of victims or culprits really in war. Do you think that's also a problem, that people have focused too much on Putin?
It's absolutely a problem, because they say then that you can't call for a ceasefire negotiations because you can't talk to Putin. And so we think it's important to give examples of how Russia and Ukraine actually have been talking on things like the grain deal to get the grain out of the country, 10 million tons of grain to reach places around the world that are in desperate need. We think it's important to mention that with the Zaporizhzhia nuclear plant, there have been talks to get the International Atomic Energy Association into those plants to try to calm the situation and stop it from literally exploding. We talk about the prisoner swaps that have been going on, several of them a month. So there are talks that are happening, and this is with, quote, Putin's Russia. We also think it's significant that now we have discovered that people like the Secretary of Defense in the United States, the head of the National Security Council, and the head of the CIA have been talking to their counterparts in Russia because they are deathly afraid, like we should all be, about this extending into a wider war, into a potential nuclear war. So when you demonize Putin to that extent, then you come to the conclusion that this war must drag on until ultimate victory, which we feel is irrational and a terrible thing for the Ukrainian people. Whereas if you put it in the context of you must talk to your enemies during wartime, that's what peace talks are all about, then there could be a possibility of actually moving this conflict into one where there is a solution at the peace table.
Okay, so let's perhaps move on. That segues quite nicely into how we can encourage resolution to this conflict. And you're obviously talking about talking to your enemies throughout war, not waiting until there's a military resolution. Isn't there an issue that at the beginning of the war, Russia was in a strong position and offered, I think it says in your book, 4 days into the war, they offered to negotiate. That would have been a very different peace treaty to one perhaps now, further into the war, where Russia suffered losses. They frankly just want to take Donbass, it seems to me, and just get out of there. Is that something that you bear in mind, the fact that their position has clearly changed over time? Perhaps, Nicolas, you can answer that.
Yeah, well, I think the fact that Ukraine and Russia were able to sit down with Turkey as, I think, a very good and honest mediator, were able to reach what the Financial Times reported as a 15-point framework for a peace agreement. And it's interesting the things they actually came to agreement on, because I mean,
is this the talks at the start of the war that we're talking about now?
Yes, back in March, in fact, and they were quite advanced. President Zelensky went on national TV to tell his people that, you know, that he was considering meeting with Putin to try and finalize this agreement, and he said our goal is to reestablish peace as soon as possible in our country, and he promised his people that you know, he talked about Ukraine's red lines in the negotiations, and you know, to reassure his people about that they were negotiating strongly for the things that were important to Ukraine and its people. And he also said that the neutrality agreement that was at the heart of it would be put to a referendum in Ukraine before it would be, you know, finalized and agreed to.
So, Medea, can I just bring you in here? Do you think it would have been preferable to have had a negotiated settlement at that point, with Ukraine making concessions, to now, perhaps, when they're in a stronger situation?
Well, absolutely. And we cite how academics have shown throughout history that having peace agreements early on in the fighting makes it much more possible to have a solution. As the war drags on, the sides get more entrenched. And we see on the one hand now, Zelensky going from his more conciliatory position to one saying now, we want every inch of Ukraine back, including all of Donbass and Crimea. And you have the Russians acting as if their referendums were somehow valid and they now control this territory that they have taken by force. We feel that those are two polar negotiating positions, and that the point now is to gather the strength, the push to make these two sides come to the table. There is never the position that Zelensky put out recently when he addressed the G20 is an example of his maximalist position, his extreme position.
Just to clarify what he's calling for at the G20, he said a return of military personnel and the 11,000 children that were deported to Russia, immediate withdrawal from the nuclear power plant that you mentioned, and no territorial compromises. Which do you think he should be willing to compromise on?
Well, it's the no territorial compromises, the issue of wanting to get back Crimea, which military experts say is just a very irrational position, that maybe it's rational to say that at some point there would be internationally monitored elections there, yes, but trying to take that back militarily, no. So this issue of territorial concessions, I think, is one that is, again, a bargaining position.
Just another point really on another thorny issue really is the issue of reparations. The West has seized quite a lot of Russian state assets. Do you believe that they should be allocated to rebuilding Ukraine, Nicolas?
I think before anything else, there needs to be a peace agreement and a ceasefire. And I think how much involvement there should be from the US and Western countries in that, I'm not sure, quite honestly.
You feel they should just back off and let Ukraine and Russia discuss without them?
I think the advantage of that, as we saw in March, is that they were able to each define their minimum conditions for peace, which they and that is how they came to the framework of an agreement. And it was in fact certainly the UK, assumed to have the backing of the US, that that essentially killed it by refusing to provide security guarantees. In fact, Johnson reportedly told Zelensky when he went to Kyiv on April the 9th that the quote-unquote collective West would have no part in any agreement between Ukraine and Russia. And so since Zelensky was actually counting on some Western countries to provide some kind of security guarantees in this agreement as a substitute or a replacement for the elusive NATO membership that Ukraine had been aspiring to.
Okay, sorry, we'll just try and wrap this one up, and then I'll just go to Medea. Do you want to finish your sentence?
Yeah, I mean, so Ukraine accepted a position of neutrality in that agreement. That was not the sticking point. They were ready and willing to do that, and they have repeated that since then. The sticking points, I think, in that agreement, which would still be the sticking points, are an acceptable resolution to both sides and to the people of Donbass and Crimea for what will happen to them. In the Minsk,
absolutely, yeah. Go on.
They made the agreement that was required to keep Donbass in Ukraine, but the Ukrainian government did not provide Donbass with the political autonomy that was promised in that agreement, and so that's where the Minsk Accords failed.
Okay, we've actually had a question from Tim Lawby, who asks particularly about the Donbass region. Doesn't Russia have the right to defend those Russian speakers? Sorry, Medea, let's have your view on that.
Well, that's how the Civil War was so destructive for so many years. And we feel that the Minsk Accords was actually a very good agreement to stop the fighting, and how it did with the observers coming in from Europe and even the US, that stopped a lot of the killing that was going on. The problem is that they weren't implemented. And so, yes, there are people in the Donbass, Russian, ethnic Russians, Russian speakers, who have faced discrimination for many years and have been faced with a civil war for many years. And we don't think that the invasion by Russia was the answer to that, but we understand that there are people in the Donbass who are asking for help from Russia.
Yes, something obviously we've seen in our media over here, and you may well dispute the reports we've had, but was that those referendums back in 2014, which were overwhelmingly, in favor of Russia, were very much held at gunpoint. And frankly, Russian soldiers were calling the shots, and there was no freedom of speech whatsoever in those elections. So I suppose the question that many have, in fact, I've just had one here pop up, is really, how do we know that those people now even want to be anything to do with Russia, particularly after the experience they've had over the last year?
I think that's where those people need self-determination, and it needs to be, I would, again, I think a peace agreement is up to Ukraine and Russia to negotiate. But if it does not satisfy, if it does not find a legitimate way to consult those people on what they want, in other words, have internationally supervised elections and referenda, then I think we will end up with a frozen conflict that will rear its head again later. But I think if the actual wishes of the people in Donbass and in Crimea are taken into account and respected, then I think that will be the key to resolving this crisis.
So if they were to have a vote and vote against Russia's wishes, you believe that Russia would respect that?
Well, that would have to be part of the agreement. I mean, that would have to be part of a peace agreement, wouldn't it? I mean, but we're not there yet, because thanks very largely to Boris Johnson and Liz Truss, who was then the foreign minister, and with a degree of US support, which is still a bit of a mystery, and they really killed that agreement. I have now heard from, including a professor who came to my book talk last week. He himself had personally spoken to Turkish diplomats who told him that, yes, it was the US and UK that killed our mediation efforts. So the role of the West in this is problematic in so many ways, and the needs of the people of Ukraine have to come first. The strategic and geopolitical issues do need to be resolved between the United States and NATO on one hand and Russia on the other, but that can take place once the actual war that is killing hundreds of Ukrainians every day has been brought to an end.
Can I just add in there that let's recognize that Russia did agree as part of the Minsk Accords that those breakaway regions in Donbass were not going to be part of Russia. They were going to be autonomous, but part of Ukraine.
Fine. Okay. Just a point here raised by Tara in London. He talks about the leaders of back in 1994. He says the leaders of Ukraine, Russia, Britain, and the United States signed a memorandum to provide Ukraine with security insurances in connection with its accession to the NPT as a non-nuclear weapons state. Says surely Ukraine now regrets this. So security assurances from the US and the UK are more necessary than ever. Obviously didn't have a good track record, bearing in mind what's happened. Medea, would you like to comment on that?
Well, certainly when Ukraine talks about now, if talks begin and it's an issue of Ukraine being a neutral country, they are going to want security agreements from powerful nations that are going to be strong enough to stop another invasion from happening. And that Zelensky made very clear, even when he was earlier on saying that now he understood that Ukraine could not be part of NATO. So yes, security guarantees are critical to any peace talks.
I presume you're not in favor of Ukraine becoming a nuclear state.
Well, I think we're in favor of getting rid of nuclear weapons throughout the world, which is now the law of the land, according to the United Nations.
Right. Same with you, Nicolas.
Yes, absolutely. I agree.
Okay. Just in terms of, I know that obviously it's not down to any of us which bits of territory get handed over or become independent, after the war is over. But I just want to raise a couple of issues that have been in the press in regards to the way, Russia has handled itself in Ukraine. Basically human rights abuses, and very, very severe ones. Human Rights Watch said the anti-Kiev forces in eastern Ukraine are abducting, attacking, harassing people that they suspect of supporting the Ukrainian government. They've been using beatings, kidnappings, rapes, as a message to anyone who doesn't support them that they'd better shut up or leave. So it would seem odd to condemn people who perhaps don't support Russia to that sort of fate. Is that not something that you think Zelensky is sort of justified in trying to avoid?
Well, that's why ending the war is so important, because war is brings with it horrific abuses. War is about killing. War is about maiming. War is about making people suffer. We want to see the end to the suffering of the Ukrainian people. We also want to see the end of the killing of the soldiers on both sides. We support the war resistors, mostly in Russia, but there are also war resistors in Ukraine. There is a whole international campaign to help them find safe places to live, to help them financially. The reason that Nicolas and I wrote this book and are on our speaking tour is because war is so horrific. We have seen it and written about it in other places. And, it's a failure of civilization to have war. And we need to evolve as a species, not to find greater ways of killing each other like we are doing now, but to find ways of living together peacefully.
Absolutely. I think most people would agree that peace is the optimum outcome. The question is, what kind of peace? And I suppose that's where the media often differs in its interpretation of events with you. Nicolas, there's a quote that if you're neutral in situations of injustice, you've chosen the side of the oppressor. What's your take on that?
Yes, I don't think
you recognize that.
Howard Zinn was a very militant anti-war activist. He was not suggesting that we should all take up arms and fight over, go to war over every injustice. And in fact, the UN Charter obligates us not to. In fact, it obligates us to resolve our disputes peacefully. And Medea and I watched with great attention the UN General Assembly, where the leaders of 66 countries, actually representing a majority of the world's population, stood up and called for peace in Ukraine, for a negotiated solution. And as the Indian foreign minister said, he said, people keep asking us to take sides. We have been very clear from day one which side we are on, and we are on the side of peace. War, we conclude at the end of our book, the real monster here is war itself, and all the political leaders who keep inflicting it on the people of the world.
Medea, how would you respond though to the idea that the charge really that if you don't stand up to a militaristic or imperialist country like Russia, there'll be peace, but at great cost, because it just means acquiescing, essentially?
Well, the great cost is allowing a war to keep going. We saw the U.S., we saw the Soviet Union in Afghanistan for 10 years, and then we saw the U.S. in Afghanistan for 20 years. We've seen the U.S. involvement for close to 20 years in Iraq and the devastation that produced. If you keep wars going, every day that they go on, more and more people get killed. So if you care about humanity, if you care about the suffering, the most important thing to do is join us in a movement to push all of the sides to end this war. And that's the purpose of what we're doing. We have a coalition called Peace in Ukraine. We're working with our counterparts all over Europe, and we're working with people inside Ukraine and inside Russia. Because we're the ones that have to put the pressure on the leaders to recognize that there is no winning of this war on the battlefield. And it's quite interesting that the highest advisor to President Biden on the military, which is the head of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Mark Milley, came out and said, Ukrainians have done a great job on the battlefield, but now it has come to a stalemate and they should seize this moment and go to the negotiating table. We even see people inside the military in the United States who are saying that, and we agree, seize the moment and go to the negotiating table.
All right, so just taking this on because we're going to run out of time fairly soon. Let me just ask, are you managing to actually reach those decision makers, either with your book or with your ideas, with your speaking? How are you managing to access those people in positions of power if they are so entrenched? Sorry, Nicolas, let's hear from you. We haven't heard from you for a while.
I don't know that we're succeeding in reaching them, but they can read the opinion polls. They can see they can see people changing their minds. 78% of people in Germany are now support going to negotiations. The American people, frankly, it's a bit of a different story because the US has done much better than Europe out of this war. They're now, we've put the people of Europe in the position of having to import liquid natural gas from the United States. In fact, to spend billions of dollars on new ports to where that can actually be processed. So, but according to La Repubblica, the Italian newspaper, the discussion within the leaders of NATO now is what would it take? What would constitute Ukraine being in a strong position to come to the negotiating table? Because leaders, even President Biden acknowledged back in June that he said, we are arming Ukraine to fight, but also to put them in a stronger position to come to the negotiating table. So the question,
I think this is the point I was raising earlier, that
but when? And it is now the German and French military leaders are even more than General Milley are convinced that the apparent success, the apparent strength of Ukraine at this point is the moment to go to the negotiating table, because that will not last. Russia has 300,000 more troops coming in. We're going into winter. There are 10 million people right now with no electricity in Ukraine. The head of the largest electric company in Ukraine is urging millions more people to leave the country. He's saying we will then have electricity to provide to the military and to hospitals. But if you can find, he said, if you can find somewhere else to stay for the next few months, that would be a big help. This is, essentially, we're emptying out Ukraine of women and children and innocent civilians and turning the entire country into a battlefield. This is not necessary. There is an alternative, and many people in high places now understand that if they did not understand it before.
Medea, any final thoughts from you?
Yes, I wanted to go back to your question about are we reaching people? It's interesting that there are a number of people in the Republican Party who are questioning the blank check for Ukraine, and it will be about $100 billion before the year's end. There are 30 Democrats who signed on to a letter calling for negotiations. They got hit over the head by their people in their own party and withdrew it. But it showed that we were getting to those people because we have been participating in meetings with members of Congress, in rallies outside their offices, in protests. And that will keep going and will start to grow as more and more people recognize that $100 billion sent to Ukraine is $100 billion that could have been used for all kinds of domestic needs. And especially the young people who are so concerned about the climate, recognizing that this is money that needs to be put into survival of the planet. And not into a war that could and must be ended as soon as possible.
Although one last annoying point to raise, sorry, that surely as a result of all that fighting and Russia actually proving to be not as powerful as everyone was led to believe at the outset, Ukraine is in a much better negotiating position now than it was back in March.
Absolutely. And that's all the more reason to say, seize the moment, go to the tables.
Right. On that note, we'll leave you there. Thank you so much to both of you. And thank you also to our listeners who've been commenting and asking questions. So we'll put this on YouTube and everyone will be able to watch it again afterwards. Just a quick plug for Fair Observer. Fair Observer is a platform of citizen journalism with over 2,500 contributors from over 90 different countries. And we would love you to join the conversation. So please do follow us on social media. You can contact us via the magazine, or you can join us here on these video discussions. Thanks very much to you, and thank you very much to you, Medea, and to Nicolas.
Join the conversation at Fair Observer and subscribe to our YouTube channel.